And I have to say, if the title of the article is "The Next Affordable City is Already Too Expensive," I could think of a more affordable move than a move to Spokane. This really is a catch-up article, I think, for people not following the housing affordability crisis. And I may have said this even last week, is it's not necessarily a housing crisis, it's a housing affordability crisis. In terms of collapsing values, that's not what we're really seeing, but we are seeing these rising rents and rising home prices, and it's, again, due to demand, which we'll talk about. But I'm going to read this whole passage because I think that it has some pretty powerful implications. So it says, again, I have to stop here, is I told you how all these articles always start with a personal story, and then they go into say, like, Joe's story is the same across the nation. Well, this one is true to form. The story plays out locally, but is national in scope. It is the story of people leaving high-cost cities because they've been priced out or become fed up with how impossible the housing problem seems. Then it becomes the story of a city trying to tame prices by building more housing, followed by the story of neighbors trying to prevent it, followed by the story of less expensive cities being deluged with buyers from more expensive cities, followed by those descending into the same problems and struggling with the same solutions. It keeps going down, maybe Spokane, and then what's the next one? What's the next one? I think, if you are an investor, investors saw this coming, I'm sure, years ago in Spokane and in Boise. But I would be looking at that second and third city down the line.
Well, they were the affordable city, and so what happens, and where do you go to next? That's where it's always interesting looking at those emerging markets. Yeah. And then when is the cycle kind of restarting? Because then you have to wait for the more expensive markets to get their rents even further up.
And that's why I've been so interested in these reports that we have from these like moving companies, but for Apartment List has it, these migration reports, is because we did see a slight uptick, not as much as people thought maybe, in mobility and in migration during the pandemic. But I think that the cause that they identified, this increase in prices, could be a really big driver if it really complements and compounds on the existing trends.
Like, I can't afford to live here anymore.
Yeah.
I mean,
and there's less barriers. I don't see, remote work as a huge factor that some people may see, but it may make it slightly easier and be a contributive effect.
It's easier to move. You don't have to be in that expensive
Mm-hmm.
location. It doesn't mean, I can move home, it's going to be cheaper, but I have to lose my job. I have to take a pay cut. Well, people are still taking relative pay cuts because they're like, they are taking into account the cost of housing these days.
But. Yeah. And I think that like I said before, there's another, just one kind of sentence at the end there. It's easier to change where we live than it is to change how we live. So if you've gotten used to this lifestyle and suddenly you can't live in the same place and support that lifestyle, then maybe you'll move somewhere else. Yeah. I haven't really seen the numbers for that, but it is an interesting report. Like I said, this article is more heavy on the anecdotes.
You don't want to go. Usually, you like the idea of going to a bigger place with a little bit more room. Trading up, not downsizing. Yeah, unless you had a big place and all your kids are old.
But another thing too that underlies this is not only is it getting more expensive in places, but then that next city is becoming, their amenities and the features of their city are becoming more more upscale. And we've talked about how suburbs and submarkets are becoming like mini cities. Well, some of these secondary cities are building out a lot of their lifestyle is starting to resemble the primary markets as well. So it's not like just one place is being grown. These places have been growing, and they kind of notice what's happening and what people are into, and so they're bringing that too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think it just makes it more important, really, to look at the long-term prospects of a market, analyze the factors behind its growth, and really determine how sustainable it is, and look for these stable cities. Maybe, I guess there are more variables at play here than the past years of rent growth, but this countervailing force of people moving to more affordable markets could become a serious consideration when doing market analysis. Now, the closing quote, and this is what I was kind of getting at, is this, there is maybe like a neighborhood, there's like a regulatory environment in which existing residents are kind of against the change and against things that might make it more cheap.
Classic NIMBYs.
Yeah, exactly. And this closing quote, and in the same breath, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I like this. I like this area, but just not from where I live."
Oh yeah, we need more dense housing, just not on my block.
But not here.
Those types of people here.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I was listening to a podcast that said that attitude is actually present among renters as well, to a certain extent. So there is this identity effect. It's kind of not, it may not necessarily mean, because if it was denser, the rents would be lower. They don't have as much of a financial stake, but there's, I think, an identity effect that they want things to stay
Still
the same.
Neighborhood.
And no, I agree. Yeah, where you live is a lot of parts of who you are, and it's going to be interesting to see how this affects mobility.
Don't like change.
Yeah.
People.
So yeah, like I said, so this closing quote says, the guy says, "I have nothing against duplexes and triplexes, just not next to my house. You know what? If duplexes and triplexes are seen as changing the fundamental character of a neighborhood, then Spokane's housing affordability problems are going to be difficult to resolve. I've seen some pretty nice duplexes and triplexes drive around that they fit in. You can kind of barely tell. And to think that that's where he's putting his bar is
that's the
very,
line. That's the line. So you're not going to allow a 200 unit.
Yeah.
5-story podium.
And I've seen this on in other forms, is like, you keep worrying about those duplexes and triplexes, you'll eventually something may come along that really does change the character of that neighborhood. And because you were focused on those little things, you're gonna miss it. You're gonna miss the real drivers of what, all of a sudden apartments are so expensive. So
as they are, although it's tough because we keep thinking things were expensive, and then we see numbers come out and growth, and the numbers kind of make sense, and sometimes they don't. And then it's like, when you're getting the information and the data, plugging it in, where it's going to go, and forecasting this stuff is very difficult.